Hello and welcome. Thank you for joining us for today's webinar. Welcome to you all. My name is Trey Calvin and I'll be your Masters of Ceremonies for today's event. Thank you for joining the Center for the Success of English Learners, or CECIL for short, for this 60-minute webinar this afternoon. Some of you may already know that the Center for the Success of English Learners, or CECIL, is a new research center funded by a multi-year grant from the Institute of Education Sciences, IES, within the U.S. Department of Education. Our mission as a center is to identify and remove barriers for English learners related to school tracking through analysis of administrative and newly collected data using a mixed methods approach. So on that note, before we begin, I do have to make a quick plug as an opportunity for you to be involved in some of the work that we are doing at CECIL. Part of the work that CECIL is doing is developing a survey to better understand the barriers that English learners face in accessing the general curriculum. We hope that you could consider supporting our research and our efforts by taking a pilot survey, which you can find online at the link that I'm about to drop into the chat. Note that your answers are confidential and you'll be helping our researchers figure out what questions they need to ask and how. You'll receive a $25 Amazon gift card for your time. And give me a minute while I drop that into the chat right here. And let me know if you can see it. I hope the link is working. I did check it beforehand, but you will be the judge of that. Just to be clear, to be eligible, you need to be a teacher, administrator, guidance counselor, or EL coordinator in a public, non-charter middle or high school. The research team is looking for educators who work mainly with English learners, but also teachers of math, ELA, science, and social studies who do have ELs in their classes, in addition to administrators and counselors who work at schools that serve at least some English learners. That's my plug for today. For that, I really hope that you consider participating if you're eligible for that $25 gift card. Now, back to today's topic. We are proud to be hosting the second installment of our 2022 Teaching for Success series. The goal of our 2022 webinar series, Teaching for Success, is to disseminate research-based information to practitioners, researchers, and policymakers that will support improved opportunities and outcomes for English learners in secondary school settings. And in just a few moments, we'll be discussing in more detail our topic today: how to approach integrating language development through content learning. Now, finally, a few housekeeping notes before we begin. The webinar today is being recorded and will be posted to our website, cecilcenter.org, immediately after it concludes. Also, I'd like to point out that the Center for the Success of English Learners is providing this event as a public service. However, the views, thoughts, and opinions expressed belong solely to the persons expressing them and do not necessarily represent the views of CECIL. Finally, we encourage you, the audience members that have joined us today, please ask us questions. That's what we're here for today, and we will be answering them at the very end of our presentation. There is a Q&A box at the bottom of your screen. You can use that to ask us as many questions as you can, and we will try to answer as many questions as we can. We also have a chat button available today, so if you'd like to chat with your colleagues and share your thoughts and opinions, you can do so. Go ahead and try it out now. Go ahead and tell us where you're calling from. And without further ado, please allow me to introduce our panelists for today. Our moderator for today's discussion is Dr. Suzanne Donovan. Suzanne is the founding executive director of the SERP Institute, an organization that engages in problem-solving research and development in collaboration with school districts and university researchers. She serves CECIL as one of the co-investigators on curriculum development. And specifically, Dr. Donovan works with the science and social studies curriculum development teams to adapt SERP materials for English learners and support the use of those materials in study classrooms. Hello, Suzanne, and welcome. Thanks for being with us.
Thank you.
Dr. Sharon Vaughn is our next panelist for today, and she is the Manuel J. Justice Endowed Chair in Education at the University of Texas at Austin. She's also the executive director of the Meadows Center for Preventing Educational Risk. She serves as the lead investigator of the social studies strand at the Center for the Success of English Learners. And she is working on with the intervention team to design practices for improving language and literacy in social studies. Good day to you, Sharon. It's good to have you.
Thank you.
Finally, I'd like to introduce Dr. Catherine Snow. Dr. Snow is the Patricia A. Graham Professor at the Harvard Graduate School of Education. In her work with CECIL, she advises on the science and the social studies material adaptations to ensure that the central pedagogical features of word generation are preserved and enhanced for dual language learners. Catherine, thank you so much for your time today on the call.
Pleasure.
All right, with that, I'm done. And I would love to turn it over to you, Suzanne, to be our moderator for today. Thank you so much.
Okay. Thank you, Jerry. So SERP is an acronym for Strategic Education Research Partnership. And the partnership is between SERP and school districts, as well as researchers that we recruit to engage with problems of practice. The very first partnership that SERP launched, we asked the school district to put their most urgent problem on the table. And the problem they put on the table was students, secondary students, struggle to comprehend their textbooks. They didn't say specifically developing language learners. They said all students struggle to comprehend their textbooks. With a grant from IES that was part of their Reading for Understanding initiative, SERP had one of those grants, which Catherine was a major researcher on, and Sharon Vaughn led a second one of those grants. But we were looking at the problem of how to support comprehension of content area texts. And with that grant, we developed a set of materials for social studies classrooms. And those materials are actually freely available to you. If I share my screen, you can see them. The site is serpinstitute.org/sogen. And on that site, you can learn a little bit about the materials, and then you can download the materials free of charge. There are 18 units that cover primarily middle grades, though some teachers use them in high school as well. And I'll ask Matt Ellinger to plop that URL into the chat in case people would like to go there themselves. So those units are providing a foundation for the CECIL work. It's critical to think about the problem of comprehending text, not only as a problem that developing language learners have, but also as a problem that as a society, we have not solved. We are not supporting students in large numbers to be successful in social studies in middle grades and in high school. So today, what we're going to talk about is both the challenge for students more generally of comprehending text that needs to be solved, and then the specific challenges of DLLs. We don't want to address challenges of developing language learners and attach those adaptations to curricula that aren't supporting comprehension of text more generally. So in the discussion today, we're going to talk about both, about the challenges of comprehending content area texts in secondary grades and about the specific challenges of developing language learners. So let's begin with a very broad question, and I'll direct the first question to you, Catherine. Why is it so challenging for students to comprehend content area texts, and in the context of today's conversation, in particular, social studies and history texts?
Thanks, Suzanne. Well, that's a question that I could spend the rest of the afternoon talking about, of course. But basically, I think the essence of the answer is this. First of all, it's important to realize that learning to read is hard. It's hard for every grade level. But in first grade, that's a rather well-defined set of challenges. First graders need to learn about phoneme-grapheme correspondences. They need to learn how to read fluently. They need to learn how to decode accurately. And if they do that, they sort of meet the benchmark for first grade. They ideally are learning some vocabulary, they're doing some writing, but reading in first grade is this well-defined, constrained task. If kids have mastered that task by third or fourth grade, then all of a sudden in fifth or sixth grade, they are confronted with very new, different, and much harder tasks. And thus the challenge of comprehension in those later grades is multifaceted and more variable. And that's one of the reasons it's such a challenge for teachers to deal with all of the different domains that students in that age range need help with, need support with. But I think a major issue is, particularly in social studies, the kids are reading about things they really don't care that much about. They do not understand why they should be reading about the Revolutionary War, or why they should be reading about the Civil Rights era, or why they should be reading about the Gilded Age. These things do not connect to the lives of 12, 14, 15-year-olds, and thus they don't have the background knowledge that will enable them to integrate what they're reading with a well-developed conceptual structure. So our challenge in the classroom is to provide the relevance, be clear about why this is worth doing, but also create access to the vocabulary and the background knowledge that will give kids something to connect the new learning to. Because we all know if you're reading about something you don't understand, it's really hard to comprehend it. And all of us can be rendered very poor readers if you give us, oh, I don't know, the Journal of Solid State Physics or the description of a cricket game. That's the situation that sixth graders, seventh graders, eighth graders are in. They're reading about the equivalent for them of solid state physics, unless we work hard to make those connections for them.
Mhm.
Well, and Catherine, one of the things you said that I want to kind of link to CECIL and what we're trying to do is you said that, unless we can make a connection for students. And I think one of the things we're working hard to do is to establish what the dilemmas were historically, and how some of those dilemmas and how some of the issues that these key historical people had could also mirror the kinds of dilemmas and issues that key people are having today. And one of the things we've learned from SERP and are integrating into the work we're doing with CECIL is to make these kinds of dilemmas current, so that these issues are faced by students in the classroom, in which they hear and read about students who are wondering about these same issues related to something in their own school, whether or not a school should use funding to build a large swimming pool that only a few students use, and to link that to something like the pyramids and whether that money was used wisely. And that kind of connection, and I think you and Suzanne were really helpful to us in seeing that we can use that kind of bridge building between the past and now to get students engaged. And then when they start reading about the historical principles, the issues that they dealt with, they do become engaged because they can relate to it. So I think that's been a big, powerful sort of high priority for us.
So let me we're going to move on in a minute to the specific challenges of DLLs. But before we do, let me just raise a question that some history or social studies teachers in the audience might be having right now with what was just said. So if they've had a background in teaching history, they will have been told you have to guard against presentism. You don't want students to think that, well, in the days of the pharaohs, they just should have unionized, or they should have used Twitter to come up with a plan for protesting, right? You want them to understand that past and present can be very different. So when you say you want to relate historical dilemmas to the present so that students have a personal connection, how do you do that without bumping up against that challenge of presentism?
That's a hard question, so I'm going to let Catherine go first.
Well, it is a hard question, and in our use of the Egyptian unit, for example, with a mixed group of low-income, middle-grade students, we saw students engaged, for example, in very serious discussion with one another about topics like, was it stupid to put jewelry and food into those pyramids for the dead, because the dead were clearly not going to come back to life and eat the food or wear the jewelry? And other students saying, no, but you have to understand, they had a different religion and they believed that would happen. So I think a key part of this is indeed to acknowledge that students are likely to engage in some misinterpretation of these relationships, but on the other hand, getting them engaged enough that they are willing to discuss them with one another, that they're willing to see these dilemmas as dilemmas that they can bring evidence to bear on, is really half the battle. Because once they understand they can discuss it and seek in the instructional materials evidence, then how do they get the evidence? Well, they have to read carefully in order to find what they're looking for, or they have to go and talk to other people to get that information. And that is the essence of learning to read by reading, rather than learning to read because somebody's trying to teach you to read.
Yeah, and I'm going to add ... and writing, because we
Absolutely.
think a critical feature is this idea of a thought book or a writing log, in which there's an interaction both between students and also with text in terms of reading, but also writing.
Mm-hmm.
And that's a wonderful feature that you've added to these units that I really like.
Mm-hmm. So what I hear is there are dilemmas that are the same today, whether you spend money to have glory or you spend money for practical purposes. To enhance day-to-day living. And those things can be drawn across time, even if the specific circumstances are different. So Sharon, we talked about some of the things that make social studies challenging for all students, comprehending social studies texts in particular. But there are some challenges that learning the English language imposes in addition to those others. Can you talk a little bit about those?
Yeah, I sure can. And I want to say that as we think about the kinds of principles and practices to keep in mind in the classroom, I want to just say that I know Suzanne and Catherine and I recognize the enormous job that teachers have and the incredible breadth of considerations they have. And that as we offer these thoughts and practices, we do that within the context of knowing that it is an enormous burden that you're lifting every day. And one, frankly, I'm not sure I could do. But anyway, back to the question at hand. I think that because of this burden, and that's why I started with it, we need to both think about universal practices for developing language that can be useful to all the students we teach. And then we need to sort of think about some of the customized approaches to teaching that enable language development in the classroom. So what I mean by sort of universal, I mean that as students have opportunities to engage with others, either through the kinds of debates and discussions that Catherine spoke about earlier, or whether we organize purposeful groups in which students have roles of responsibility in those groups and accountable roles that engage them with each other. We think of that as team-based learning and have spent some time developing those roles, or whether students are engaging in debates or paired learning. We know that students universally need opportunities to use and develop language, and that it requires them in these kind of functional, purposeful groups. We also realize that there has to be some kind of customization, and that customization may be something like thinking about these essential words that I sometimes think of as having sort of Velcro words that are very powerful that help us learn other words. And in history, a word like, equal or equality or equity becomes such a Velcro word because it's useful to us in so many contexts. And so we need to customize some of the instruction to be sure students are able to access the learning that we're providing. So that's kind of a general idea, but I think that might be some of the ways in which we can enrich it.
Mhm. And are those challenges of learning the Velcro words, do you see those as particularly, are those words going to be different for developing language learners than they are for English only speakers?
So both. So we really almost, we're in this dilemma right now around words. And this is really a subtext that could take, a couple of hours, but I have to say it. The dilemma around words is they really are sort of the cryptocurrency of learning. So they're so important, they're so valuable, they're so powerful. And yet people are sort of picking up the idea that students need to learn words and we need to teach words and we need to emphasize them. And the sort of wonder about with that is we could be spending so much time on that we can't really build the background knowledge and provide other instructional resources that students need. So it's this sort of words are important, but we can't teach all of the words all of the time, or we can't get anything else done. So the answer to the question is we need to think about words. We need to think about how we make students word learners, word aware, word conscious, so that words become part of their everyday, every life experience. So we've got to sort of teach them to be word conscious. And we also have to teach them essential words. And there's some words that all students need. And there's some words that some students need. So I know that is a challenge that teachers are aware of, but it is in many ways our most important challenge.
Mhm.
And Catherine, you've made a living on this topic, so please embellish.
A very paltry living, I should say. Well, I think we often, in designing educational interventions, focus on the parts and forget about the whole. And the words are one of the parts, right? And it's easy to teach them. If you teach 50, kids will learn 30, and they get a better score at the end of and then they'll forget 20 of those before the next test. So I think the way you really learn words is when you encounter them and discover that you want to understand this sentence and you can't unless you know that word. So as you said, Sharon, a culture of word consciousness, being aware when you don't know you don't understand what you're reading and when that might be associated with vocabulary, and a culture of curiosity, encouraging students to be unafraid about asking or looking up the words they don't know. I think that's in the long run what's going to take students to the next level, and that's particularly true if in mixed classrooms with English only and DLL kids together, because of course there will be different distributions of what they know and what they don't know, and as you say, you can't teach everything that all of them need. But the background knowledge carries the words, and the words carry the background knowledge. So I think that's the crucial message.
So we have the message about needing to focus on particularly the power words or the Velcro words that are going to carry a lot of the content, and seeing the bigger picture in terms of the background knowledge that brings that vocabulary alive. Sharon, you mentioned that it's also important for students to work in small groups and to have a chance to use language. I suspect that teachers who have DLLs in a classroom with English only students are wondering how you make that work well when some kids speak easily and often, and other kids hesitate to speak at all because they don't have a command of language.
Yeah, you word that so well, Suzanne. And we also want to be mindful of not putting students who are developing their confidence about using English in positions in which they feel like they have to speak when they're reluctant. So I do think that we need to consider multiple grouping structures. If we only use whole class grouping structures day in, day out, many students in our class will not have comfort levels high enough to develop their discourse. And so grouping structures that include pairs and small groups. And my experience over the last 8 years is that the more we structure these groups in terms of the roles and responsibilities we expect each student to have, and that, excuse me, involves group accountability, meaning the whole group is accountable for some product or resource or presentation, as well as individual accountability, where each student in the group has something they are responsible for. Without that kind of structure, it is very difficult to assure that every student will have a chance to practice and engage.
Right. So Catherine, that's a cue because word generation, social studies generation, those programs are all based on the opportunity for that kind of interaction. Can you talk a little bit about why discussion and debate, even in content areas like social studies, why debate is such an important feature of curriculum from your perspective?
From my perspective, debate can become the reason why kids bother to go to school, right? First of all, so one feature of it that's very important is that it is energizing and engaging. In the normal classroom, teachers have all the speaking rights. And students have the right to answer questions and get feedback as to whether the answer was correct or not, but they rarely have the opportunity to express their own opinion, to protest if they disagree, to ask questions, except for maybe procedural questions like what page are we on. And the introduction of procedures like debates absolutely shifts for the 30 or 40 minutes that it might go on, or 20 minutes, however long it goes on, absolutely shift the power structure in the classroom, and in the process shift the identities, right? The students assume new identities as the people, the principals in the interaction. And that you see them come alive. Now, that's not saying that you can just have a debate about anything any old time. I mean, a good debate, and one in which students are exchanging ideas, listening to each other's ideas, learning how to anticipate others' disagreements with them and counter those disagreements, so they have to think carefully, learning how to articulate their own positions and disagreements with others, so they have to learn some language to do that. That all benefits enormously from several prior days of reading about the topic, of hearing about the topic, to be debated, and of engaging in pair and small group debates, small group work sessions that expose them to the different points of view that will ultimately get expressed in the debate. So this isn't debate isn't a simple solution, but it is a really powerful mechanism because it gives students an opportunity to talk. It gives them a reason to think deeply about a topic, to collect evidence about that topic, and the responsibility to defend a point of view. And those are uniquely revolutionary possibilities for students inside classrooms.
And you know, Catherine, you said this, but I just want to underline it, which is that the debate isn't something that happens every day. The debate is the product of hard work on the part of students that give them access to these powerful positions they hold. And this hard work, and I think this is really, to me, a vivid opportunity for DLLs to develop a voice they're willing to use in the group and in the classroom. Because part of that process is they are learning the content, they're learning the essential words they need to use for their position, they're learning the role they're going to play in the group during the debate. And all of that is developed over a 2-week period of time in which their confidence initially grows in a small group and then grows so they're willing to participate in the class as a whole. So the debate is really kind of a culmination of a heck of a lot of work.
So Sharon, you're a co-PI on the CECIL Center work. And you decided to choose some of the SOGEN units to adapt for DLLs. Can you say a little bit? You already hinted at a few things. You said vocabulary is essential, and you need to hit on vocabulary. Those units do. Group work is essential. But can you say a little more about why you chose the units that you chose? What is it that you think supports effective learning, and how you are thinking about the adaptations to those units to better support DLLs?
Yeah. Well, SERP materials are really terrific. And so being able to start with those as a foundation is really more than a foundation. And architecture really has been an enormous asset to us. In terms of the units or content, frankly, those are really related to the ways in which many states choose the content they're going to teach. And we're working in middle school, so right now in middle school. So that was kind of the way in which we thought of that. But we also wanted some sort of thorny and meaty issues to read about, write about, think about, talk about. And those were available in the content we selected as well. In terms of how we advantaged ourselves of the resources there and how we extended them, we really thought about what I would call the principles that we want to be mindful of as we revise and think about teaching DLLs in a classroom. And some of these principles we were talking about earlier are what I think of as universal, meaning beneficial to many, many learners. And some of them are what I think of as customized, meaning they are uniquely beneficial to DLL students. So for example, a consistently beneficial practice is to use snippets of a video or snippets of a graphic or snippets of a visual image. And when I say a video, I don't mean 10, 15, 20 minutes. I'm surprised you people can stay with us this long. We can't listen to anything very long. So a couple of minutes, but that kind of makes a key idea that we're trying to teach or an essential word come to life. So that would be what I would call a customization. A second customization would be that we might provide writing supports for students to get started in responding to some of the content they're reading or some of the dilemmas they're resolving. And then over time, fading some of these writing supports so that students become more confident and independent as writers. That would be the kind of customization we would use. Thirdly, we would use some supports in terms of talking during a debate, in which we give students some key phrases to get them started in positioning their argument so that they have a reduction sort of in the cognitive language load while they're preparing for the debate by having some of the work done so that they can then add or pour in their ideas into this frame. So those are examples of ways in which we try to customize some of that work.
Can I just
Yeah.
add a quick note? Another source of customization that SERP has experimented with in more as not experimented with, I should say, has offered as supports is providing some of the texts in the student's native language, right? So that the thinking can go on in the home language, although the performance in the classrooms we're working in typically has to go on in English because that's what the expectation is. We've tended to work in classrooms with very mixed language backgrounds, so this is not always an easy thing to do, but it's certainly a resource that should be considered in more homogeneous other language groupings.
Great. So the project and the original SERP units are limited in terms of the quantity of materials they provide for teachers. In some ways, they can be thought of as model units that stretch across part of a year. But teachers are really going to have to develop these practices for themselves. And so I want to, before we turn to audience questions, I want to summarize what those principles are that you've touched on thus far in terms of what teachers might do in order to strengthen the instruction for all students and in particular for developing language learners. I heard you say, Sharon, that it's absolutely essential that we target the high impact Velcro words and that they need to be used repeatedly. I heard you say, Catherine, that we need to stop boring the heck out of students and provide them materials that are both interesting and feel relevant, even though we have to make sure they understand the difference between the past and today. Some of the dilemmas are the same throughout history. And so making it relevant to students is important. I heard you say, Sharon, that it's important to have students working in small groups. That's where they can use language with each other, have the opportunity to speak, which is essential to developing their language. And Catherine, you called out the value of discussion and debate as motivating students to learn. And Sharon, you also called out the importance of giving opportunities for writing and for supporting especially English learners to track their arguments across a unit, to produce arguments and to write those arguments. Are there things I've missed that you've said that are important? And are there things you would add as guidance to teachers who are trying to figure out how to be more successful with their students?
Well, I guess perhaps this is implicit in what we've already said and you've summarized, but if small groups of students are going to work together productively, as Sharon has described, they need to have worthwhile tasks. They need to be working on authentic questions. And 90% of what goes on in student-teacher discourse in the average classroom consists of closed test questions and short student answers. So just opening up the space for students to talk more through authentic questions and giving them authentic tasks to work on would, I think, be a crucial additional component of a well-designed lesson.
Sharon, is there anything you would add?
I think those are really good working principles and practices, and about as much as any teacher could handle.
Yeah.
Um,
Yeah. And I'll second your observation that teachers are doing incredibly challenging work that many of us, and I will raise my hand, would not be very capable of doing, the complexity of the work they do. Catherine, you wanted to add something?
Precisely why this kind of good curricular support is so crucial. As a guide and as a support, as a fallback, because teachers should not be expected to invent everything. We need to give them more help to do what they're doing well.
Absolutely.
I often say, Catherine, they can't fly the plane at the same time they're building it. That is just not fair.
Okay, well, we will now take questions from the audience, and I'm going to turn it over to Trey to moderate this part.
Thank you so much. Thank you guys for your comments and for all these questions that we're getting. Right now, I have a couple of questions that I'd like to get to immediately, but I do want to encourage you on the chat right now to jump over to our Q&A box and let us know your thoughts. Let us know your questions. We'll have about 10 minutes, maybe up to 15 minutes to go through questions, and then we'll need to wrap it up. All right, our first question comes from Francisco Alvarez Gabriel. He asks, how does acculturation impact language development in content area in secondary classrooms? How does acculturation impact language development in content area and secondary classrooms?
I would need Francisco to explain a little more what he means by acculturation.
Well, Francisco, that is on to you. If you want to drop that in the chat, we'll get back to your question. He does have another question, though, that he did follow up with in a similar vein. How can educators support emergent bilinguals build vocabulary and background knowledge while also maintaining the fidelity to the curricular pacing?
That's the one I wanted to get to.
There we go.
I think one of the other brilliant innovations that Sharon and her team, her collaborator Letty Martinez and her other collaborators have introduced to the SERP SoGen units is more time. I just think that the pace at which teachers are expected to present and students are expected to absorb material in social studies is absurd. It's a pace which forces a focus on lots of facts and very little deep learning. And there's no point to that. Ultimately, they will forget the facts. So I would agree with you, Francisco, that you're not going to maintain fidelity to curricular pacing, nor should you.
Sharon?
Yeah, I mean, you can't have it both ways. It's really, I don't think possible. And so you can travel, at the speed of light across decades and decades of history and sort of, at the end of this whirlwind, gosh only knows what will be taken away. Or you can tackle some very important and critical historical issues in ways in which the likelihood that students will learn words and background knowledge and world knowledge is very positive. And we hope, this is the tricky part, that it also improves literacy outcomes around reading and writing. So it all kind of is entwined.
If I could just add that the amount students can accomplish has a lot to do with how motivated they are to accomplish it, how hard they work, how much time they choose, time and focus they choose to give to something. And that gets back to using content that is engaging enough to them, giving them chance to discuss with each other and argue with each other so that they're really motivated to build that language and use that language. So it's not just time, it's how effectively that time is used, and motivation can make all the difference in the world in that.
So I now see Francisco's answer about acculturation, and I think I realize what you're getting at, and I think it's a really important issue that we have I hope transcended the era in which the purpose of schools is to turn everyone into a monolingual, monocultural American. But I think social studies is precisely the place where these issues can be dealt with most powerfully. I mean, I realize in Texas, where Sharon works, students get a whole lot of Texas history. But my guess is they get that Texas history from a particular perspective that does not reflect the Mexican perspective on Texas history. Every history lesson has different participants on different sides of the issue. And if we want to talk about in acknowledging and incorporating students' background knowledge, students' home languages, and their identities, then a debate about all of those crucial events in the history of Texas would be a wonderful place to start, I think.
Well, thank you, Francisco. Thanks for giving us that extra context so we were able to answer your question. I'm going to move on to a few more that I have here that are really interesting. There's a great coincidence here. There's a Mr. Chris Hagee on the phone with us today, who is a former student of the Harvard Graduate School of Education. And he's asking a specific question. Can you speak to you, Dr. Snow, can you speak a little more on the way native language instruction should be used in classrooms? As much as possible, as a strategic scaffold, gradually removed over the course of a year?
Well, native language used, not necessarily native language instruction used, but native language resources. I think when you're thinking about something that's really hard and you're trying to sort out your thoughts about it, you want to do that in the language that you speak best. And I do that when I might be giving a talk in Spanish, but I sure outline the talk for myself in English before I give it in Spanish, because that's the context in which I think more clearly and organize my thoughts more effectively. And I think Spanish-speaking students should have the right to do that too. And if there are several of them, they can engage in all of the peer interactions together in whatever language they want. So I wouldn't put limits on the use of home languages in the classroom, although there are all these challenges when you have multilingual, multiple languages represented. But I think it is clear that students will also benefit from expectations that public performances and writing be accomplished in English if that's the language in which they're going to end up being assessed.
Any comments, Sharon or Suzanne?
No.
Okay, here's another one from Elizabeth. Thank you, Dr. Snow. Elizabeth writes, for entering and emerging multilinguals, do we give them grade level texts? There's someone on the call or on the chat that said something about we shouldn't be practicing the ay pobrecito syndrome with our multilingual learners. Oh, that poor little guy, So what are your thoughts on that in terms of grade level text especially for new emergent bilinguals?
Yeah, I mean, we've gone through an era of leveled text. We have an era where some people think that you have the text level that you can read, it's identified, you read on that text level. If it happens to be lower than your grade level, so be it, etc. And I I guess my thinking on this is the best way to support language and literacy development is to think about the accordion of text that students need. They need to read some text at their level, reading level, for sure. And it is beneficial syntactically and semantically, and in terms of background knowledge and essential words, that they have access to text that is at their grade level and related to what they're learning. And that access gives them chances to see some of the complexity of the issues. Now, does that mean it goes unsupported? In other words, if a student reads at, let's say, the 3rd or 4th grade level and the text is at the 7th or 8th grade level, are they handed the text with no supports? Well, of course not. However, they're also not denied access to those texts. Supporting those texts can come in many profitable ways, including pre-teaching all proper nouns. That is very helpful to students. Complex nouns and really help students understand text. Reading aloud for the group segments of that text that are more complex and going through it. So there's ways we can build supports for students so they can access these more challenging texts. So I would argue students need a range of texts. We do not want to limit their texts, and we certainly don't want to limit their text to what I consider kind of under nutrient, low-level texts.
But discussing those texts with someone else can be a way to access them if they're otherwise too hard. I mean, I'm part of a book group, and I always learn something from my book group, other co-book group members when I discuss the books with them. I don't know why we don't let kids do that too.
Yeah.
We've come almost to the end of our time today, and I do have a special guest that I would like to bring on. Mary Spida, would you like to, there she is. Hey, Mary. So surprised we have a special guest with us today. Mary is the co-principal investigator with Dr. Aida Walke at the West Ed's Center. So we have a sister center that's also funded by an IES grant, sister center of CECIL's, and she's working on study 3 of that grant program, which is deals with the development of 8th grade ELA educative materials. And she has been listening intently as one of our surprise panelists. She's going to tell us a little bit about her, the center that she's working on, and some of the ways that it's been overlapping to shed some light on how we might address the topic of today's webinar. So Mary, I'll turn it over to you.
All right, thank you. So I'm very pleased to have this opportunity to offer a few comments on this really wonderful presentation today. And I do appreciate IES's wisdom in granting 2 centers whose portfolio of work is clearly so complementary. I first want to comment that I really appreciated the discussion today on the social nature of learning. Catherine just ended with commenting on the importance of being able to talk. And it sounds so simple, but just really highlighting that social nature of learning and the importance of quality interactions and affordances offered to English learners. That really resonates and mirrors key aspects of our curriculum in math and ELA that we are currently developing in our study. Similarly, I appreciate the discussion on the integration of teaching language and content in tandem, rather than teaching discrete pieces of language that are somehow pulled out and taught devoid of any content. And again, the idea of really supporting students talking about what they're learning and talking about difficult texts and working together to co-construct understanding. And then finally, I want to say that in our own study, we began this hour with a discussion on the difficulty that students have in comprehending complex disciplinary texts. And we found the same. that students really struggle with grade level text, with complex text across the disciplines. And so we have designed our materials to be educative for both teachers and students. And so we highlight the pedagogical moves and rationale for teachers in order to deepen their expertise as they go through the curriculum. And we also wrote educative materials for students to provide clear examples and explanations for why they're doing what they're doing, as was mentioned earlier in the hour, why they're reading these particular texts, and really focus on developing students' metacognitive skills in order to tackle these texts, their agency and their autonomy. And so I'm just so pleased to hear how our studies really seem to support each other and support students in similar ways. So thank you for having me.
Thank you, Mary. I just posted a link to the Resource Center that you are a part of so that folks can check out all the great resources that are there. There are multiple white papers here's one, argument-based framework for validity applied to comprehensive system of assessments for English learners in secondary grades. And there are just brief after brief after brief. It's a really lovely website. It's very easy to navigate. And I encourage you to all check that out. It is called the National Research and Development Center to Improve Education for Secondary English Learners. I would like to thank all of you. We're going to wrap up at this point. So I just want to take a few moments to thank our speakers, especially. So Suzanne for moderating and asking such great and pointed questions, for Dr. Snow, Dr. Donovan, and Dr. Vaughn for their time today. I would like to thank you, the audience members, and for your time and attention. I know, as we were talking about, it can be tough to stay on a call for this long as we are all zoomed out, but I do want to thank you for your time and attention, and to remind you that if there was some colleague that wasn't able to make it today and you would really like to share this with them, do not fret, because we will be posting this webinar on www.cecilcenter.org, and I'll put that link into the chat now so that you can bookmark that immediately and never forget it as soon as we are done with our webinar today. And it will also be shared with you via email, so you might be able to forward that to that colleague who wanted to do something else at 4 Eastern this afternoon. There's also a range of resources that we talked about today during the call, and I will be sending those out in an email momentarily, as well as a brief feedback survey. So you can tell us how we did today and how we might improve. We have our third of this series webinar coming up in July. That date and title is TBD, but we will be communicating that in an email in the coming weeks, and we will look forward to seeing you at that time. So again, thank you all for your time today. That's going to wrap us up 2 minutes early, and I hope you guys have a wonderful rest of your week, and good luck, and thank you for everything that you do. Okay, see you guys later. Bye now.
Okay, bye.
Bye.